Now, our Ruth scripture reading this morning is Ruth chapter 4, verses 13 to 22. So Boaz took Ruth home as his wife. The Lord blessed her, and she became pregnant and had a son. The women said to Naomi, "Praise the Lord. He has given you a grandson today to take care of you. May the boy become famous in Israel. Your daughter-in-law loves you and has done more for you than 7 sons. And now she has given you a grandson who will bring new life to you and give you security in your old age." Naomi took the child, held him close, and took care of him. The women of the neighborhood named the boy Obed. They told everyone, "A son has been born to Naomi." Obed became the father of Jesse, who was the father of David. This is the family line from Perez to David: Perez, Hezron, Ram, Amminadab, Nahshon, Salmon, Boaz, Obed, Jesse, and David. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Now, I have noticed lately that I have accumulated a fairly respectable stack of Bibles. I have about 15 of them, unless I've got another one tucked away somewhere that I've forgotten about. They are all different versions and shapes and sizes. The covers are any color you can imagine. I have a couple of those little New Testaments and too many big, clunky study Bibles. I even have a really old one that's been passed down for generations among the women on my mother's side of the family. And I still have my first grown-up Bible that I got, a King James version that my parents gave me when I memorized my multiplication tables at age 12. Now, one thing that only a few of my Bibles have, and maybe you've got a Bible at home that has this too, it's those pages at the beginning for listing important family dates, births and baptisms, marriages and anniversaries and deaths. It's a real treasure trove of family information written down for posterity and for future generations. Now, the Webb family, my dad's family, has one of those really enormous Bibles. Have you ever seen one? They're about 1 foot across and that high. They weigh about 20 pounds. They were really, really popular back in the late 1800s. We have some here at St. Andrew's that I discovered in the last few weeks when I've been rattling around in here by myself. Anyway, we Webbs have got one too. It's been in our family for over 100 years, and it has this beautiful sheaf of paper in the front for writing down all sorts of family details. There's even a special page that you can insert photographs into. It's an absolute goldmine of Webb family history, or it would be if anyone at any point in the last century had bothered to write anything down. Those pages are pristine. But even so, over the years, we've managed to fill out our family tree with dates and names and stories using public records and old letters and documents and memories and photographs. Last fall, though, I succumbed to the lure of those ancestry DNA tests. Now, if you're not familiar with them, what you do is you order this kit and it comes to your house and you spit into a specially provided tube. This was before the pandemic. And then you send it away for scientific analysis. And then it tells you where your ancestors were from. You get these graphs and charts and percentages, and you learn all about these new, exciting places that you can connect yourself to, however distantly. Making family trees and exploring our genealogy, they're popular hobbies nowadays, whether you do it the old-fashioned way or if you go all high-tech and use DNA testing. And it's an ancient hobby, too. Even if we forget to fill out our own family history in the front of our Bibles, there are many other genealogies recorded in there, dating back to the very beginning and running right up to Jesus. That desire to map out our ancestry comes from a need to fit ourselves into the pattern of the world, to connect with our own history and to find our place within the epic story of humanity. And knowing where we're from, knowing our backstory, help us make sense of our lives right now. It helps us to understand the people we are, why we like certain things or think certain ways. And it lets us imagine the people that we might someday become. Today we're going to talk a little bit about the last part of Ruth's story. Her story ends almost like a fairy tale. She gets married, has a son with Boaz, a grandson for Naomi, and they live happily ever after. This ending is the answer to every bitter question in Naomi's heart. Remember that at the beginning she thought that her story was coming to an end. No more husbands or sons for her, no hope for security and peace in her old age, no future legacy of grandchildren and great-grandchildren. But now, through Ruth and Boaz, through God acting to provide abundantly for all three of them, there is peace and security, family, and hope for the future. Imagine telling that story to little Obed as he grew up. His grandmother's grief, his mother's loyalty and courage, his father's generosity and willingness to cross cultural borders to help foreign-born Ruth. It's an exciting bedtime story for any little boy. Now, we know Ruth and Naomi's backstory, if you will. We know what circumstances and history and experiences brought them to this wonderful, happy ending. But what about Boaz? Reading those genealogies filled with names of people you didn't know, it can be a little dull. But if you were listening closely, you may have recognized a few names in Jesus' family tree. Boaz was an Israelite, and so was his father, Salmon. But his mother was Rahab. Now, one of my favorite stories in the Bible is the fall of Jericho. Jericho was a great walled stronghold, a city inhabited by Israel's enemies, the Canaanites. Joshua, Israel's leader at the time, sent spies into the great city to assess their military might. Rahab, recognizing the power of Israel's God, hid the spies in her place of business on the condition that they promised that she and her whole family would be protected. After Jericho fell, Rahab and her family became part of God's people. Imagine the stories little Boaz heard growing up. Stories about independent and courageous women. Stories about family and loyalty. Stories about foreigners seeking the protection and care of Israel's God and being made welcome. Those stories, being part of that family, growing up, hearing about Rahab, that shaped Boaz, and it must have affected the way he saw Ruth too. When we look back through their stories, we can see where God has been working away in both Ruth and Boaz's lives to bring them to this moment where their stories come together and become one in this warm and hopeful happy ending. If you want to build your faith in God, one of the best things that you can do is look back. Imagine spreading a long piece of paper out in front of you and drawing a timeline of your life, marking out all the big turning points and the small moments that led up to them, the big life-changing events and the ordinary days, everything that got you where you are today, that shaped who you are right now. Looking back, where might you see God's hand guiding your story? Now, human beings have been telling stories for thousands of years in every culture. Myths and legends, history and fairy tales, fables and parables. We tell stories about the world around us and about each other and about ourselves. It's not as much a matter of accuracy and facts and dates as it is about trying to make sense of our lives and what we experience. Our stories are like signals in the noise. They're how we make sense, make meaning of our lives, and how we understand ourselves to be connected to one another, part of a family, part of different relationships, and part of a community. And just like we did with Ruth's story, when we tell our own stories, we can connect them with God at work in us and through us and for us too. Those family trees we read about today, Ruth's short one and Jesus' much longer one, they show us what can happen when we connect our stories to God's big story, when the meaning of our story is infused with God's plans and purposes for us. Because of Ruth's loyalty and courage, because of Boaz's generosity and hospitality, because of Naomi's bruised but enduring faith, the same abundant fullness, the same peace, the same hope for the future that they were blessed with was poured out for all of Israel through King David and all of humanity in Jesus. The impact of those three small personal stories woven together, Those stories are part of what shaped all of us who believe in Jesus. Ruth and Boaz and Naomi form part of God's big story of saving and restoring all creation through Christ. And so do we. So this week, if you've got a bit of paper and some time on your hands, tell your story to yourself. Draw out that timeline and start marking it up. Don't worry too much if you can't recall precisely the dates and locations and that sort of detail. This is your spiritual journey, not your Wikipedia page. Remember what happened and why it was important. Remember when you had faith in hard times and when your faith was shaken as badly as Naomi's was. Remember when you were grateful for what God did and when you struggled to see him moving in your life at all. Remember when you were in need, like Ruth, and God put someone in your path to help you, like Boaz. Tell your story and be amazed at what God's faithfulness to you has looked like, at what his loving and living hand has done in your life. Those lists of names and dates in the front of our Bibles, the births, the baptisms, the marriages, and the deaths, it's good information, but it's a list of names. It doesn't really tell us who those people were and what their lives were like. My DNA ancestry is fun and interesting to know, but facts don't mean much until we use them to tell a story. Stories help us understand why we are the people we are, and they help us dream about the people we might become. Stories are how we figure out what things mean, what's important, and what's true. And the truth of the story of Ruth is that God provides abundantly. On their own, these 4 short chapters that we've read show us how involved God is in shaping our stories, even when we don't see him moving at the time, but fit within the pattern of the much larger story of God's people, set in amongst Abraham and David in the family tree of Jesus, even connected to us, part of our family heritage through faith. The meaning of Ruth's story is still that God provides abundantly, but now we see that God provides abundantly for us all. Thanks be to God. Amen.